Hello, Connecting Point. Welcome back to our study through the book of Romans, and we're going to be picking up this week halfway through chapter 1. So I want you to recall where we left off last week with Paul declaring eagerness to be in Rome with this little burgeoning multicultural church that has kind of sprung up in the center of the world, and to share with them the gospel. Now, this week we're going to start to see Paul put a little more meat on the bone of what exactly he's talking about when he says the word gospel. This is a word that comes up through the four gospels, as you might have guessed. But what gospel literally means is good news. And so I wanted to start you off with a table talk, and I want to ask you this question. What does the gospel, or the good news, and specifically the good news about Jesus, do? What is the work of the gospel? What does it do in your life? What does it do in the church more broadly? Okay, take a couple minutes with that. We're going to see that Paul is going to set up his good news by having it respond to some specific bad news that we all know, every one of us knows in our heart of hearts. And we're going to be taking the next few weeks to actually explore the full nature, as it were, of this bad news. I guess not the full nature, but some examples of what this bad news is. And that's what the first section of the main body of Romans is going to do, is basically to establish the brokenness of humankind. So we're going to read just to the end of the first chapter to kind of get us started down this path. And next week we're going to pick up the next section of text, and I want you to think about linking these texts together. One of the things that Romans is really good at is having punchy single ideas, important lines or verses that are like memory verse type things, that are so pithy and so concise and so relevant and to the point about what the important messages of the Christian faith are, that we sometimes will skate over the fact that Romans is doing this bigger work where it's kind of building a case, and Paul's he really does that, builds a case throughout the series of the letter. There's so many of these one-liners that we kind of forget to think about linking the whole thing together. But I want you to do that as we go through the study, to remember that Paul is going to be throwing out threads in order to pick them up later and weave them back into his argument. And he chooses his vocabulary very purposefully to create a kind of a cumulative argument that acknowledges the human condition and then presents us with the solution to our problems. So we're going to jump in at chapter 1, verse 16, and we're going to go until the end of the chapter. For I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is God's power for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek. For the righteousness of God is revealed in the gospel, from faith to faith. Just as it is written, the righteous by faith will live. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of people who suppress the truth by their unrighteousness, because what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, because they are understood through what has been made. And so people are without excuse. For although they knew God, they did not glorify him as God or give him thanks, but they became futile in their thoughts, and their senseless hearts were darkened. Although they claimed to be wise, they became fools, and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for an image resembling mortal human beings, or birds, or four-footed animals, or reptiles. And therefore God gave them over in the desires of their hearts to impurity, to dishonor their bodies among themselves. They exchanged the truth of God for a lie, and worshipped and served the creation rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. For this reason, God gave them over to dishonorable passions, for their women exchanged the natural sexual relations for unnatural ones, and likewise the men also abandoned natural relations with women and were inflamed in their passions for one another. Men committed shameless acts with men and received in themselves the due penalty for their error. And just as they did not see fit to acknowledge God, God gave them over to a depraved mind to do what should not be done. They're filled with every kind of unrighteousness, wickedness, covetousness, malice. They're rife with envy, murder, strife, deceit, hostility. They're gossips, slanderers, haters of God, insolent, arrogant, boastful, contrivers of all sorts of evil, disobedient to parents, senseless, covenant breakers, heartless, ruthless. Although they fully know God's righteous decree that those who practice such things deserve to die, they not only do them, but also approve of those who practice them. Well, I hope you're feeling encouraged by our text so far. I actually do hope you will feel encouraged by the text by the end of our message today. But even reading through that first little chunk of the text, I'm kind of staggered by the mental power of Phoebe, who we briefly talked about last week. Doug brought up this Phoebe person who was the deliverer of the message of Romans to the Roman church. We meet her kind of by name in chapter 16, so we'll end up talking about her more in the springtime. But Phoebe was the person tasked with delivering Paul's letter to the Roman church, or the set of churches that were in Rome. And the writing conventions in Paul's day, they didn't use punctuation to mark out where the sentence breaks were, or paragraphs. They didn't do that either. So Phoebe would have had Paul's written word to go on without any punctuation, but then would have been tasked with reading the letter out loud to the church or churches to whom she was delivering it, and then would also have been tasked with understanding Paul's thinking and writing well enough to explain it and field any questions that came up. I've only read about 3-5% of the text of Romans, and I'm already feeling a little swamped with thoughts and questions. So we'll take a bit to break it down a little further. So let's take a little time to focus in on that top part of our section today, verses 16 and 17. I'll reread them just briefly. For I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is God's power for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek. For the righteousness of God is revealed in the gospel from faith to faith, just as it is written, the righteous by faith will live. In verses 16 and 17, we see it's kind of a last preamble to the main body of the text that Paul is getting into. It's also kind of like a thesis statement for what Romans is about to do. It explains kind of the work of the gospel and in a pithy way what the gospel is. It's this idea of the righteous living by faith. Paul focuses also on this particular division between Jew and Greek in this last opening kind of comment. The Roman church had experienced an upheaval. So Doug talked about it briefly last week, how the Roman church probably emerges out of the Pentecost event, where Jews from all over the world had been gathered in Rome, or in Jerusalem rather, and then when the Holy Spirit comes upon the disciples, they hear the message of Jesus, the good news of Jesus, and Peter explains it to them, and then they go out and start churches in their own places, in their own cities. And I actually talked about that a couple weeks back in our 2 Samuel 7 talk as well. It connects. Don't worry about it. Go back and watch the video if you need to figure out how it connects. But the Roman church had experienced a particular politically driven upheaval within the church. Probably it had been predominantly Messianic Jews who had started the church in Rome. But by the time this letter to the Jews, or to the Roman church, is written, the Jews had been expelled from the city of Rome by the Emperor Claudius. They had since been readmitted into the city, but the character of the church had likely changed quite heavily from a predominantly Messianic Jewish church to a more Gentile-oriented church. And one of the key themes that we're going to be seeing coming up throughout the letter is this division between Jew and Greek, and that Paul is really concerned to bring unity to these two groups. To qualify that a little bit, and we're going to talk more about this idea next week, I don't want you to only think about Jew-Greek being the division, but also about these categories that Paul gets around to identifying later in the book, strong and weak. And these are different kind of groups of people who need to learn to have grace for one another. But we'll come back to that as we go through. But I want you to keep that in mind, that this unity focus is a key thing that Paul is trying to do. I also want you to notice what verse 17 does to establish that unity, right? God's power of salvation to everyone who believes, first Jew, then Greek. And then we have this statement about the righteousness of God and how that the goodness of God, his holiness, his his moral rightness, his righteousness is revealed in this gospel from faith to faith. It's a description of how the God is revealed and the righteousness of God is revealed in this gospel and through faith. And in fact, Paul says that the righteous will live by faith, which is a quote taken out of the Minor Prophets, Habakkuk chapter 2. But it's kind of a vague statement in some ways. And so exactly what the nature of the righteousness of God, kind of quote unquote, has been much debated throughout Christian and church history. And we're going to talk briefly about one particular person for whom this verse played a hugely significant role in his life. And we'll come down to that in a minute. So there's been kind of three prevailing interpretations. The first one is that when we talk about God's righteousness, what we're talking about is an attribute of God. It's that holiness, his moral rightness, which, if you think honestly and carefully about it, is a little bit scary. Because if you think honestly and carefully about your own moral standing, you don't live up. And I don't either. And so standing as an unclean man, right? It's the Peter reacting to Jesus after Jesus performs the miracle, and he says, "You don't look at me, I'm a sinner, right? Like, don't even talk to me. I can't be in your presence. You're a holy man here," right? Or Isaiah in the throne room of God, right? "Oh, you need to clean me because I'm an unclean man from an unclean people," right? This is the kind of correct response in some ways to what God's righteousness is in this, sense number one, as it were. But then there's also kind of as church history goes on, there's this development of what we're talking about in talking about the righteousness of God here, or God's righteousness. So the second one is kind of a righteousness from God. And this is the idea of that God's righteousness is a status that is given to believers because God has justified them and then declares them now to be righteous. So it's like a freely given gift. It's a declaration over people who maybe don't deserve it, but God nonetheless gives it. It's a free gift, right, of God. That's very much a Reformation understanding of what God's righteousness means here. But the third one has become this more prevailing one in the last century or so. And this is the idea of righteousness that's done by God. And it's a more total action than just God declaring or imputing righteousness to a believer, to the faithful as a status. It's more like God's work in setting things right again in the world, turning the world right side up again. It's kind of this dynamic idea of God recreating creation. And through Jesus beginning this work, right? And so our being given that status of righteous is part of that work, but it's not the entirety of that work, if that kind of makes sense. So like I said, there has been something of like a progression throughout church history, but I don't know that it's really worthwhile to say, well, number 3 is correct and number 1 is an incorrect understanding of what Paul means by the word righteousness here. I think it's probably more useful to see a term like God's righteousness as a large and multifaceted concept, and that the writer is really, Paul doesn't get more specific than saying God's righteousness, because he wants you to think about the variety of ideas that can come up when you're meditating upon a concept like this. Paul is sometimes hard to understand because we get hung up parsing through, what does he mean by this word or that word, rather than kind of reading ahead and reading his other writings and coming back to it with this more nuanced, multifaceted understanding, and kind of thinking about the broader meaning. So without belaboring this verse too much more, we should take a moment to acknowledge that historical character who found Romans 1:17 so significant, and that's our friend Martin Luther. So this is the verse that caused Luther to begin to question a lot of the medieval Catholic doctrines that he had held to as a theological scholar and an Augustinian friar, the clear statement that righteousness is a product of faith and not of works, your moral works, or of money, really threw a lot of what the Catholic Church had been teaching into question for him. We'll come back to that in a second, but one of the developments that's been neat to see kind of in a historical context is that I think both Protestant theologians and Catholic theologians have been moving towards each other in their understanding of what we mean by God's righteousness there. And many wise thinkers from both sides of the modern day fault line of Catholic Protestant are more in agreement than not at this point now on how God's work of justification and of imputing to us righteousness happens, right? And that's an exciting thing. So I'm going to take a break now for a table talk, and here it is. Does thinking about a word like righteousness as a multifaceted word help to make a little more sense of a word like that? So how do you then understand God's righteousness? Okay, so we're going to transition out of verse 17 into verse 18, and you may experience a little bit of whiplash, just like I did, when we do that. I guess when you read verse 18, you can see it on the screen, the point is clear that through faith the righteous live, but that the flip side of this is that the unrighteous or the faithless, those who persist in unrighteousness or unfaithfulness, have a harsh comeuppance coming their way, to use a bit of a euphemism for it. It's in verse 18 that Paul really begins to explain the good news, and so what he does is he establishes this really bad state of things that we find ourselves in. God's wrath is real, and it is coming, and in fact is already even happening, and we're going to see an example of that a little further down. For Luther, until the full weight of the verse 1 verse 17 came to bear on his thinking, Luther really identified that wrath of God, verse 18, as one of his initial problems with thinking about God's righteousness. In his anguish about his own moral state, you got to remember, Luther is a guy who, he practiced all kinds of things to try to mortify sin in his body. He was a bit of a maniac. He would punish himself physically to try to get rid of sin, and he lived a very moral life. He tried really hard to be the kind of monk he knew he was supposed to be, according to understanding salvation to be by good works. So in his anguish about his own moral state and continuing to find this decay and brokenness and sin and anger and all the other things that he came across, Luther claims that, or in his writings you can read that he claimed that he did not love and indeed hated the righteous God who punishes sinners, and secretly, if not blasphemously, certainly murmuring greatly, he found himself angry with God. And that's quite a statement to make, but it is, in some sense, it's kind of the correct mindset to have if you don't understand grace and what role grace plays with the Christian faith. So much of the Protestant understanding of being born again comes from Jesus in his discussion with Nicodemus, which of course you can go read in the Gospel of John chapter 3, but it's also informed by Luther's own experience of reading verse 17 of Romans, as the faith and righteousness come together in verse 17, and they work together. And so Luther observed that it is the nature of faith that it presumes upon the grace of God, and that faith doesn't require information or knowledge or even certainty. So it changed his mindset, and seeing that instead of a wrathful God waiting for you to screw up or something like that, Luther saw, oh, God is ready to impart grace because he's a gracious God. His righteousness is there for you because God loves you, because he's a gracious God. In his righteousness, he acts graciously, not only wrathfully. And so Luther came to have what he described as a love as great as the hatred with which he had before hated the righteousness of God. And it's a radical shifting of the mind when you go from seeing a holy God as a terror to a holy God as a loving Father who is there to help you and to love you and to, to protect you, and ultimately who wants to serve you, amazingly enough, considering that he's the creator of the universe, and that in response then you can embark on this relationship with him, and it's as his servant and as someone who loves God. I think it's truly one of the remarkable moments in Western history in some ways, because it changes the course of religious history quite drastically. But it also helps us to, have a more nuanced approach to what Christianity is today. And I think it's the reason why Christianity kind of survives the tumult of the late 15th century. We don't need to get into all of that too much. That's a story of a different movie. So, but anyhow, we'll move on into what Paul continues to describe, because in verse 19, Paul introduces this other big concept that we sometimes call general revelation, which is basically how Paul describes it. Everyone knows who God is on some level because his nature, logical, orderly, etc., and his power as the creator of the universe, the sustainer of the universe, the moral lawgiver for the universe, are all obvious within what we observe in creation, right? It's Psalm 8 is what Paul's referring to, right? The heavens declare the glory of God, and this kind of idea. If one goes on and reads some of the best pagan, pre-Christian philosophy, and like for me, I'm thinking of Plato and Aristotle particularly, but you can probably think of other examples. One of the things that you'll see is that these non-Christians approach describing God, the God that we see revealed in the Bible, through reason. And they approach, Aristotle uses this phrase, the unmoved mover, which is a remarkably Christian concept in some ways, and he doesn't get there through special revelation of Bible. He gets there just through thinking. Now, Paul would not ever say that reason alone is enough to save someone, that thinking your way into salvation is not a thing. We already saw in our text today how the righteous will live by faith. But Paul is saying that honestly applying one's reason does give a person a sense that they fall short. Even of their own compromised standards in relation to this creator of the universe who does things in such an orderly and magnificent way. So what he says is that then everyone is left without an excuse for this, and that we see this list in verses 21 and 22 of where this leads. Failure to acknowledge God, futility in our thinking, darkening of our hearts, well, their hearts is the word he uses, not our yet, claims to wisdom, but in fact folly and foolishness, and then ultimately exchanging the glory of the Creator God for these cheap imitations from the created world, right? So to plant a seed about some of what we're going to end up talking about next week, Paul then uses some very kind of Jewish wisdom literature language to describe how the Gentile world experiences the depravity of refusing to honor God. So it was a typically Jewish criticism of the Greco-Roman world to note that there was a complete lack of restraint on what they would have considered deviant sexual behavior. And one of the commentators suggests that Paul is kind of goading the Jewish believers here, or maybe we'll call them the weak believers next week, but we'll leave that for now, to feeling self-righteous about things. So the language that you read here in verses 24 to 27 is pretty similar to what is found in the Wisdom of Solomon, which is one of the deuterocanonical books that you can read in the Catholic Bible. It's a significant intertestamental Jewish text that has ended up in the Catholic Bible. But I don't want to get too far into that example. Verses 26 through 31 then go into giving this description of how it goes wrong. And so verses 26 and 27 are obviously going to be a very controversial pair of verses in our time. But there is, I think what you really want to see here is that there's like a bit of a remorseless logic to what Paul is showing us in verses, like in this idea of when you reject the Creator God and your mind becomes futile and your heart becomes darkened. you get turned over to your sin. And that's what he describes with that description of the sexual depravity or deviance, however you want to describe it, in verses 26 and 27. People who lose restraint on the things that are against the intended order of the universe end up dealing with the consequences of their behavior. And this doesn't only need to be a sexual example. You could think of something like a person who can't restrain their anger or their impatience while driving. And they will, of course, receive the due penalty of speeding tickets or of getting arrested for punching someone because of their road rage or something like that, right? Like there's a bit of a remorseless logic that if you can't contain sin, it will explode out of you in ways that you're probably not ready to deal with in terms of consequences. I think the commentators are right in noting that Paul is using that sexual example as an effect, because his list then goes on to describe all kinds of other sin. It doesn't privilege sexual sin in any sort of way. He lists it as, one example amongst all these others. And so you can see that as the vice list is developed in verses 29 through 31. This big long list of vices that made us all feel so good and positive about our lives earlier when we read through it. You can find similar vice lists in Matthew 15 or Galatians 5, 1 Timothy 1, 1 Peter 4. But kind of where we land on the whole thing is that Paul notes that when people are fully turned over to the futility of their thinking, this darkening of the heart, they no longer even disapprove of things that they know have consequences, but in fact they celebrate when evil is done. And you can think of the different things that people want to shout in our culture these days, right? And the pride that people take in all kinds of stuff. That just, it just isn't the way things are supposed to be. So now, I know we're all going to be coming, every one of us is going to be coming at this passage and this kind of list of hurt and of behaviors that we read from a different perspective, a wide variety of life experiences. And honestly, I don't really want you to leave off here by just meditating upon, how have you broken the law of God today, right? Because that's kind of where we're going to land. We want to wrap up now. And there's a lot of exploration of this bad news that continues on in the text before we come back to the good news of the gospel that Paul is so excited to share. So to make sure that we're approaching this with both that humility that we should have, but also with the confidence, that faithful confidence that we can have because we know that the righteous live by faith, I want to take a moment to kind of pull a couple of verses out for you. It's worthwhile to think about the nature of that list from verses 29 to 31 and be honest with ourselves with it. Because even if we haven't given in to being gossipy or a murderer or disrespecting our parents or whatever other ones you have maybe not done, I'm sure there are a few of them that you have at least dabbled in from time to time. There are other vices that you're going to be guilty of within that list. One of Luther's spiritual successors, John Calvin, describes the human heart as a factory of idols. And so verse 23 also should give us pause as we think about the ways that we substitute things for God in our lives. What are the other things that we look to be our sustainer, or to be the thing that gives us confidence, or to be the thing that gives us hope or motivation or whatnot? And if we've replaced God with whatever it is, we're inviting these vices to take root in our lives and to become more and more difficult to deal with. And it's a dangerous thing. One of the commentators I was reading actually talked about the risk of idolatry, even in picking up his old hobby of photography. It's a pretty benign kind of a thing to do, but he was moving into the empty nest phase of his life as he was writing his commentary, and he said, yeah, I mean, I can feel the risk of like making an idol out of buying a new lens or whatever, right? Like there's things that come in the way, and even good things that we can enjoy, we can make them into idols, and we do all the time. Our hearts are factories of these idols. But though we should have a humility that's engendered by these kind of sobering thoughts about the vices that we're kind of prone to, or the ways that we've replaced God in our lives, we can also approach God with confidence because of where we started. In verse 17, the righteous by faith will live. By faith. And we don't need to have the answers. We don't need to have come to him having performed righteously, because God gives that gift freely. Luther followed in Paul's footsteps, realizing that all of his very best efforts, including self-flagellation, were worth nothing ultimately. But when he cast himself upon God's grace, Luther had that sense of being born again, of being renewed. And if that language of being born again, a born-again Christian, is uncomfortable, I want you to think about it in terms of renewal, or getting a do-over, right? The idea of that life renewal is going to be a theme that is going to come up throughout our study of the book of Romans as well. So I want to leave you with a table talk to think a little bit more about that concept of God's righteousness and applying it into your own life, having looked a little bit at the logic of what God's righteousness means as a broken person in this broken world. So here's the last table talk question. Do you find God's righteousness a comfort? Or do you find it angering? Or do you find it scary? And pray together that you will learn to love and appreciate God's righteousness as you approach him, both in humility, but also in that faith-filled confidence. And have a great week.